artistic experience a unique kind of experience that is cut off from regular life experience, or is it continuous with it? I'm philosophy professor and co-host of Overthink podcast, Ellie Anderson, and I'm going to share some ideas from John Dewey's Art as Experience today. This is part of the syllabus that I usually teach on philosophy of art, and I use this aesthetics reader, so you're welcome to follow along with me there if you've been watching some of the other videos. For John Dewey, an experience is defined as follows. It involves a rhythm of intake and outtake. Dewey was quite influenced by early 20th century biology that really emphasized the way that human embodiment, or really any sentient embodiment, has an input and an output. There's this intake and outtake rhythm. For Dewey, in addition, experience has a unity, right? So of course, our life is a continuity of experience, but we can think about that experience as broken up into unified wholes within it. Think about a meal, for instance. A meal is an experience, and sure, the moment that you get up from a meal, you're going on to do something else. There's not a break in the experience as such, but especially in retrospect, there has been a unity to it. Same is true of a storm. While you're within an experience as well, it has a pervasive quality that John Dewey talks about on page 305, where he actually brings up the example of the meal and storms and talks about this pervasive quality. An experience has a unity that gives it its name. That meal, that storm, that rupture of friendship. The existence of this unity is constituted by a single quality that pervades the entire experience in spite of the variation of its constituent parts. This unity is neither emotional, practical, nor intellectual, for these terms name distinctions that reflection can make within it. So even before we get to a reflective level, such that somebody asks, hey, how was that meal? And you can say, oh, it was wonderful, or oh, it was decent, right? You can encapsulate it in a single feeling or a single word. We have on a pre-reflective level a sense of that experience as a unified whole with that pervasive quality. And that's what then allows me to label it as having been decent or wonderful and so on. What's more, experience for Dewey has a conclusion. It has a fulfillment to it, right? A culmination, the end of the meal or the point of the meal, to gather or to eat, etc. This general account of experience that Dewey gives then translates into his philosophy of art. Because for Dewey, artistic experience isn't a special, unique kind of experience cut off from other experiences, but rather the aesthetic has a quality that pervades any experience that we have. The aesthetic, he says, is just this quality of unity. And so any experience that has a quality of unity is therefore aesthetic. And so pretty much like the meal, the storm, the experiences that we were just describing, anything that we are saying is an experience cut off from that general continuity of experience, which he says is loose, has like a loose succession, or is on the other hand, like overly restricted and mechanical, is going to count as an aesthetic experience for Dewey. So this is a very broad notion of what counts as aesthetic. Artistic experience, he says, is internally integrated. It involves ordered and organized movement. Experience is emotional, practical, and intellectual, but these aren't separate within it. Think about that quote that I read a minute ago. It's only within reflection that we can separate out the emotional, practical, or intellectual parts of it. Similarly to the rhythm of intake and outtake that characterizes experience in general, Dewey thinks that artistic or aesthetic experience involves a rhythm of doing and undergoing, and specifically a harmony between the two. This harmony occurs both in artistic production and in aesthetic perception. A lot of philosophy of art focuses on reception by the person who is viewing the art or listening to it, etc., right? And not on artistic creation. There are some counterexamples, right? And for instance, Kant, but most aesthetic theories have to do with reception rather than creation. But Dewey wants to say that the distinction between production and perception, or between creation and reception, is illusory. The artistic and the aesthetic are deeply connected. It's just that the artistic has to do with production and the aesthetic has to do with perception, but these are deeply connected. They shouldn't be separated out when we're thinking about them in experience or even philosophizing about them. Because Dewey thinks that artistic and aesthetic experience is continuous with everyday life, one question might emerge then, well, then why would we even call this artistic or aesthetic? Well, in addition to the points that I just made about how the artistic he associates with the production of art and the aesthetic with perception of art, the more substantive answer that he gives in this is that art is kind of a peak of experience, but it's not separated from the mountain range that constitutes experience. Art is an intensified form of experience relative to everyday experience, even though they exist on very much the same continuum. For Dewey, theories that isolate art as apart from this continuum are social symptoms. They're symptoms that something is wrong in society. And that something is wrong for Dewey is at least partly capitalism. He talks on page 299 about how the growth of capitalism has been a powerful influence in the development of the museum as the proper homes for works of art, but the very structure of the museum makes it seem like the artwork is cut off from everyday experience, both for the producer and for the receiver of it, right? Or the recipient of it. And so for Dewey, part of restoring the continuity of aesthetic experience and artistic experience with everyday life is re-envisioning our social and economic and political structures so that they're not creating this artificially autonomous sphere. He also sees a negative side effect of this autonomous sphere or treatment of art as an autonomous sphere as being in what he calls a holier-than-thou attitude, which you see in patronage and other markers of superior cultural status, where being interested in art is a marker that you are of a higher class than others.